So today we're going to talk about social beliefs and judgments. And particularly, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about judgments that we make, many of which are unconscious judgments and are not always accurate. So we're going to start out by talking about how we judge our social worlds, then we'll go into how we perceive our social worlds, then how do we explain our social worlds, and then finally the importance of social beliefs. What impact do those beliefs have on other people and on our own actions? So we're going to start out by talking about judging our social worlds, both consciously and unconsciously, although for the most part, we're actually going to focus mainly on the unconscious processes that impact the judgments that we make. Now, if you remember from chapter 1, I talked about how we have two different brain systems. We have our system 1, which is the automatic, it's kind of out of our awareness. This is our intuitive process, kind of very much like relying on your gut. You don't spend a lot of time kind of consciously thinking it through. It's just an automatic process. And then you have your system 2 thinking, which is definitely more conscious and effortful. You may sit there and kind of weigh out the pros and the cons. So both of those systems are going to impact the judgments that we make. Now, typically, system 1 thinking, system 1 influences a lot more of our actions than we realize. We're going to talk about some of the ways that the system 1 thinking actually influences our actions today. One of these ways is priming, and you may have learned about priming before in a previous class, you may not have done. But priming is essentially this premise that, and what researchers have found is that things that we don't even consciously notice can actually subtly influence how we interpret and recall events. So essentially what happens is our memory system is a web of associations, right? It's connections between things. You may think of something and that makes you think of something else. And all of these flood of memories, your memories come flooding back into your awareness based on kind of a one thing that was connected with those other things. So it's a web of associations. And priming is actually the awakening or the activating of certain associations. You may smell something and then all of a sudden that brings back a whole bunch of memories. For me, toast. For some reason, toast reminds me of my grandfather. And so when I smell toast, it brings back a whole bunch of memories and thoughts related to my grandfather and eating breakfast in the morning. Experiments show that priming one thought, even without the awareness of the individual who is being primed, can actually influence another thought or even an action. And we know that priming effects actually surface even when the stimuli are presented subliminally. What subliminal messaging, or what that means is they're presented too quickly to be perceived consciously. So in other words, if you were to ask the person, did you see this, or were you aware that this, that you were shown this, the person would say no, because the information was maybe flashed really quickly in front of their eyes, but too quickly, just in a millisecond, that they were not consciously aware of having seen it, but their brain actually did register it. So when unconscious, here's some studies, it's kind of interesting. When unconsciously primed with the word bread, people are actually going to find the word butter more quickly than bottle or bubble in a word search. People are more likely to wobble on a balance beam if the room is filled with posters of beer than in a room that's filled with posters of juice. Exposure to the smell of all-purpose cleaner actually made students quicker to identify cleaning-related words. They were more likely to recall cleaning-related activities, and they actually kept their desks cleaner. And then the exposure to the smell of fish in a lab actually made participants more suspicious of each other and less likely to cooperate. Fish, fishy, the idea of kind of being suspicious. If somebody's fishy, you're not going to entirely trust them. Kind of interesting, right? These are these things that people aren't really aware of, and yet that's impacting their behavior, whether they're wobbling on a balance beam, whether they're cleaning, keeping their desk clean, how they interact with others. This actually happens in everyday life as well. After watching a scary movie alone, we may be more likely to interpret noises as an intruder. How many of you have done that? How many of you don't like watching scary movies alone because you're freaked out afterwards? Depressed moods, if you're feeling down, feeling upset about something, feeling sad, that tends to prime negative associations. So in other words, when you're feeling down, you may actually find it a whole lot easier to remember bad thoughts, bad memories, things that are negative. And good moods, when you're in a good mood, that actually typically makes you more likely to remember positive associations, good things, good memories. So you see, it's kind of a vicious cycle, or it can be a good thing, right? Going up way, putting you in a better mood too. Another kind of form of priming that occurs in everyday life is something called medical student syndrome that I teach about in abnormal psychology. And I think students tend to do it in abnormal psych too as well. But this idea here is that if you're exposed to information about illnesses, it actually can cause students, med students, to focus on their anxieties and their symptoms. So they suddenly feel like they're experiencing these things because they've been primed with this information about specific illnesses. So priming is super powerful, right? We can prime thoughts subconsciously. We can prime people with information, and that can influence their behaviors, how they feel, all of these things. Interestingly, though, even physical sensations can prime our social judgments. And this is referred to as embodied cognition. Embodied cognition is essentially the mutual influence, the interplay between our bodily sensations and our thoughts, our cognitive preferences, and social judgments. The brain systems that process our bodily sensations actually communicate with the brain systems responsible for our social thinking. So there's interplay going on here. And research has shown, for example, this interplay by a number of experiments. They found a number of things. For example, after receiving a cold shoulder from somebody, in other words, if somebody just kind of ignores us or they're not friendly to us, we actually judge the temperature in a room to be colder than it actually is. We tend to feel more lonely after we hold an ice pack from the freezer than one at body temperature. And we tend to judge a room as colder if we're eating alone. So you see how the idea of temperature and feeling lonely or feeling kind of ignored by other people, the two are related to each other and they kind of play out together, which is interesting. And this is referred to as embodied cognition. Some other ones, when holding a hard ball, we judge a face as more likely to be Republican versus Democrat and more likely to be a physicist. And then when sitting on a wobbly chair, individuals judge others' relationships as more unstable. Kind of interesting, right? So the wobbly chair, the instability of the relationship, we definitely can be primed with physical sensations, and that can impact the thoughts that we have. There's definitely an interplay. So priming is one way that our system one, that automatic, out of our awareness, intuitive thinking kind of influences how we judge the world and our actions. Another way that this occurs is through intuitive judgment. And we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of intuition. Let's talk first about the pros of intuition, the powers of intuition. Some examples of intuitive thinking or system one thinking include schemas. Okay, we talked about schemas in the previous chapter. If you remember, these are mental concepts or templates that guide our perceptions and interpretations. So when I say to you best friend, you're probably going to have all of these kind of characteristics that come to mind. You might think of the best friends that you've had in the past. You might judge, okay, best friends tend to be loyal, they tend to be friendly, they're people you can rely on, fill in the blank. You're probably going to have a bunch of words that come to mind when I say that. Or if I said to you dog, you're going to have the specific words, the characteristics that come to mind when I say the word dog. So schemas actually are intuitive, right? We don't have to think about them consciously. These occur automatically. Another form of intuitive judgments that we use frequently is emotional reactions. Emotional reactions to things are typically instantaneous, and they typically occur before deliberate thinking, because essentially what happens in our brain is information goes from our sensory organs, whether it's our eyes, whether we're seeing something, hearing something. The information goes from the sensory organs through the thalamus to the amygdala, which is our emotional control center, before the thinking cortex has a chance to intervene. And this helped us to survive predators because it allowed us to essentially feel an emotion, and then our fight or flight response would go into play super quickly. If we had to kind of spend time thinking about something and evaluating how to act, we'd be screwed if there were a bear chasing us, for example. We need to be able to respond super automatically without having to think about it. So a lot of our emotions are automatic, and we typically do not process them or think about them. That occurs more slowly. Skilled behavior is another form of kind of system one thinking, system one behavior. We don't typically think about what we're doing. Once you've learned to drive a car, once you've learned to ride a bike, if you play the piano, you play golf, at first when you learn those things, these began as probably a very controlled and deliberate processes. For example, you may have learned, okay, I need to place my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I need to kind of bend my knees slightly when I'm swinging the golf club, putting myself in the right position. All of these things are gonna, like, they're very deliberate and very controlled at first, but the more we practice these behaviors, whether it's driving our car or whatever, riding our bike, they're going to become more automatic. They're going to become more intuitive. So now when you get in behind the steering wheel, you don't think about 10 and 2, you just automatically put your hands on the steering wheel the correct way. You know automatically to turn on your turning signal, hopefully, before you turn, to tell the cars around you that you're wanting to do so. These are automatic processes, automatic behaviors, and so these are examples of System 1. And then also snap judgments are another form of System 1 thinking. And these are really snap judgments when we just make a judgment about a person. For example, if we look at that picture and we kind of make a judgment about who they are as a person, snap judgments are actually better than chance at guessing characteristics about a person from their photo. So snap judgments can actually be pretty accurate, interestingly. Studies of individuals with brain damage actually show that even when our memory or certain sensory organs are impaired, individuals can compensate with their System 1 thinking. So your textbook has this really fascinating example of a patient who couldn't form new explicit memories. And so if you ask the patient, okay, do you remember doing this? They wouldn't be able to tell you having done so, even though they'd just done it 10 minutes earlier or an hour earlier. And so this one patient could never remember her doctor. But one time he decided he had a tack in his hand when she shook hands with him. And so obviously the tack hurt her. And after that, she refused to shake hands with him, even though she did not remember having met him in the past. Her System 1 thinking and the memory and the brain had compensated and had reminded her, hey, there's pain associated with this person, even though she didn't remember him. So that's kind of a fascinating case study there. Many routine cognitive functions do actually occur automatically and unintentionally without awareness. Now, okay, so these are some pros, some good things about into the System 1 thinking, the intuitive judgment. Let's talk about some of the limits, though. Lots of researchers have actually spoken up against the power of intuition. For example, we tend to be error prone in our hindsight judgments. When we think back about, how we would have done things differently or whatever, we tend to be, when we look back, we tend to kind of bring up errors, make a lot of errors. We also tend to experience illusions. These are perceptual misinterpretations, fantasies, constructed beliefs. We'll talk about some of those today. And illusory intuition, for example, appears in how we take in, store, and retrieve social information. So yes, System 1 thinking can be super helpful, but it also cannot be that helpful too. It can cause us to make some errors. Let's talk about overconfidence. As I mentioned, System 1 intuitions are sometimes wrong. Even though they do tend to be more efficient and automatic, they are sometimes wrong. And typically, we're actually unaware of the errors that we make when we're using our System 1 thinking. We typically display overconfidence. And what we found is that incompetence tends to feed into overconfidence. So the less you know, the more confident you typically are, interestingly, because it takes competence, it takes knowledge to recognize the lack of knowledge. We may believe that we're right until we learn that we're wrong. Students, kind of some studies supporting this, students who scored the lowest on tests of grammar, humor, and logic were actually the most prone to overestimating their abilities. So they thought they were funny, they thought they had, strong logical skills, strong grammatical skills, but in reality, they actually scored the lowest on these tests. Because those who don't know what good logic or good grammar is often, those people are often unaware that they lack it. And I always kind of talk about how, when I'm talking with students about how I went into my PhD program in psychology and in counseling psychology, Um, well, I should say I came out of it feeling like I knew very, very little, because I realized when you learn about a topic, you realize how much you really don't know. And so knowledge and humility actually go hand in hand. Overconfidence typically implies that a person doesn't know a ton. What we know is that ignorance from one's incompetence occurs ignorance of one's incompetence, so not knowing that you actually suck at something, tends to occur mostly on relatively easy seeming tasks. So if it's something that seems easy, like, oh yeah, I get grammar, I can, form grammatical sentences and stuff. It seems like an easy task. People are more likely to say, yes, I'm good at it, when in fact they're not, and they're not aware of the fact that they suck at it. On more obviously difficult tasks, poor performers tend to more often appreciate their lack of skill, because it's clear to them that they cannot do it. Research suggests that when we estimate our chances for success on a task, people tend to be overconfident when the moment of truth is far off in the future. So if I said to you, oh, what are your chances of getting a graduate degree, because it's far off in the future, you would say, oh, I'm going to do it, I can do it. But as you get closer to that actual, let's say, applying for graduate programs, and as you get closer, your confidence level is actually going to drop. So the distance from the task actually has an impact on overconfidence. The further you are away from whatever the task is, the more overconfident you are. The closer you get to it, you lose some of that overconfidence. Some examples of overconfidence in different areas include stockbrokers, for example. Very frequently will experience overconfidence, and this can result in some pretty serious financial consequences. Political overconfidence, if you look at political leaders in the past, Hitler was confident, Johnson was confident about South Vietnam, Bush was confident about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but none were found. Student overconfidence. Students who are overconfident typically do worse on tests, probably because they stop studying, right? That overconfidence actually causes them to spend their time doing other things besides studying, whereas those who are not as confident are actually going to be doing the things they need to be doing to perform well. So why does overconfidence persist? Why do we continue? Why are people overconfident? If it doesn't bode well, if it doesn't have good consequences, why does this trait continue? Well, we actually like people who are confident. Highly confident group members tend to become the leaders, even when their confidence is not justified by actual ability. So kind of keep that in mind. If ever you're doing group work or whatever, just because somebody seems confident does not mean that they know everything. Confidence and accuracy and confidence and competence do not go hand in hand. Let's talk about confirmation bias and how this may impact overconfidence too. Confirmation bias is essentially referring to our tendency to not seek out information that may disprove what we believe. My guess is if any of you have Facebook accounts and you've unfriended people because they don't share your beliefs, and you probably are suffering from a little bit, or you've used a little bit of confirmation bias, you've been victim to that. We're very eager to verify our beliefs, but we're less inclined to seek evidence that may disprove them. So let's say we read something that doesn't line up with our beliefs, the things that we think are true. We are very frequently just going to disregard them. We're going to push them aside and be like, oh, well, that doesn't matter. We'll find some way of rejecting them. And this is referred to as confirmation bias. Confirmation bias appears to be a system one snap judgment. It's an automatic process. It's not something that we do so consciously. Using system two thinking actually makes us less likely to commit this error. And confirmation bias helps explain why our self-images are so stable. We tend to seek out, elicit, and recall feedback that confirms our beliefs about ourselves. We actually even tend to seek out friends and significant others who bolster our own self-views. Even when we think badly of ourselves, we're going to find people who share very similar views about ourselves as we do. So what are some remedies for overconfidence? Well, something to keep in mind is being wary of other people's dogmatic statements, right? Dogmatic statements would be overgeneralization, saying something is always a particular way. That implies a level of confidence that is very rarely merited by society, a situation, it is very rare to find something that is always true. So be wary when you hear those statements. Suggest overconfidence and not necessarily competence. Get prompt feedback from other people, right? Get feedback quickly from other people so that if your beliefs are inaccurate, you can actually be open to changing those beliefs quickly before you start kind of clinging on to your beliefs. And then also think about why a judgment might not be true. Instead of just kind of taking stuff in as you hear it, kind of challenge it a little bit. Think critically about it. Why could something not be true? And this is especially important right now in the age of kind of fake information, false information, fake news. Think about critically about everything that you take in. So overconfidence is definitely a problem when it comes to System 1 thinking. Let's talk about some other forms of System 1 thinking. One of these is heuristics, and heuristics is really just a fancy word to refer to mental shortcuts our brains and our minds take to process information quickly. We need these. Our brains are processing so much information, whether it's what's going on in the world around us, reflecting on that, multitasking. Our brain is going to try to take shortcuts. Our mind is going to try to take shortcuts as much as possible so that it can process information quickly. And heuristics are thinking strategies that allow us to make really quick and efficient judgments. They typically allow us to make routine decisions with minimal efforts. And in most situations, our System 1 snap generalizations are pretty adaptive, but sometimes they make us wrong. So we're going to talk about two today, the representativeness heuristic and the availability heuristic. The representativeness heuristic is the tendency to presume, sometimes despite contrary odds, that someone or something belongs to a particular group if it resembles or represents a typical member. And so this is where stereotypes are going to come into play. So I'm going to give you a scenario here, and then I'm going to ask you a question to kind of illustrate this. So Sarah loves to listen to New Age music, and she faithfully reads her horoscope each day. In her spare time, she enjoys aromatherapy and attending a local spirituality group. Okay, that's Sarah. Is Sarah more likely to be a teacher or a holistic healer? A holistic healer is somebody who, if you don't know this, kind of works with people holistically, considering the entire body, the mind, the body, spiritual things, all of that kind of wrapped into one. So is Sarah more likely to be a teacher or a holistic healer based on that description? Most people are going to say she'd be a holistic healer because she fits with our preconceived ideas about holistic healers. We're actually bad at taking in base rate information. Base rate is really just a way of saying how common a behavior or a characteristic is in general. School teachers are way more common than holistic healers. How many of you know school teachers? How many holistic healers do you know? So it's probably more likely that Sarah is a school teacher than a holistic healer, just because of the probability, right? We applied a stereotype here and we thought, oh, she sounds like a holistic healer, so she's probably a holistic healer, but the chances are, statistically, she's probably not. In evaluating the probability that a person belongs to a category, we need to consider not only how similar the person is to other members of the category, but also how prevalent that category is overall, the base rate, right? How common holistic healers are, for example. So the representativeness heuristic is one example. Of a heuristic or a mental shortcut that we take. The other one that we're going to talk about is the availability heuristic. And the availability heuristic is a tendency to judge how likely something is, to occur, because and assume that it's a lot more likely because it's available in our memory. So for example, everyone right now is probably worried about, and will be probably for a while, dying of COVID-19 because we're hearing about these cases, right? The information is right there. If memories come readily to mind, we actually presume it to be commonplace. We think it's a very common. So in other words, we overestimate the likelihood of something happening because we have lots of memories or we've heard about it a lot in the news. So if I were to ask you whether you are more likely to die from a car accident or a stroke, you might say car accident. In fact, strokes are twice as likely. Car accidents or digestive cancer. Digestive cancer is actually 3 times more likely. Diabetes or by being murdered. Diabetes, you're 4 times more likely to die from diabetes. So you see here how we'll hear about some things in the news, car accidents and being murdered, but in reality, it's the things that we don't hear about that are actually more common, but we're inaccurate in our assessment of that because we don't hear about it so much. And that is an example of the availability heuristic. Let's talk about a few final influences on our social judgments. Counterfactual thinking is one thing. And counterfactual thinking is essentially just imagining alternative scenarios and outcomes that might have happened but didn't. For example, you might be thinking about, what would you be doing this summer? What would your plans be for next semester if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic? Or so on, right? Imagining maybe what would life be like if you'd gone to a different college besides NSU? Imagining better alternatives and thinking about what we could do differently next time in cases where we've screwed up, that actually helps us prepare to do better in the future. Now, the more significant and unlikely the event, the more intense the counterfactual thinking is. Most people actually do live with more regret over things they didn't do than what they did do. And in one survey of adults, the most common regret was not taking their education more seriously. So keep that in mind while you're in school. So counterfactual thinking also influences our social judgments. Let's talk about illusory thinking now. The illusory correlation is perceiving a relationship between two things when no relationship actually exists, or perceiving a stronger relationship than actually exists. The example I like to give of this is my brother. One day, a few years ago, probably a decade ago at this point, he looked up and he said to me, ever since 9/11, every time I look at the clock, it's like 9/11. Well, obviously, the number of times that 9/11 showed up on a clock had not changed after 9/11. But he was noticing it. People easily misperceive random events as confirming their beliefs. And if we believe that a correlation exists, we're more likely to notice and recall confirming instances. In other words, my brother is way more likely to notice every time it says 9/11 on the clock and not notice the times and remember the times when it didn't. He's going to remember the times where it actually confirms his belief that this has been occurring more frequently. So finally, moods and judgments. Our moods also infuse our judgments. Unhappy individuals actually tend to be more self-focused and brooding, but they're also more motivated to engage in intense thinking. A search for information that makes one environment more memorable, understandable, and controllable. Happy people, even people who are actually made happy by small gifts, they actually report that their belongings, things like their cars and their phones, work better than those who did not receive a small gift. When people are happy, the world seems friendlier, decisions are easier, and good news is easier to think of. Think about priming here. Whereas bad moods can prime our recollection of negative events. Interestingly, we do not attribute our changing perceptions to our mood shifts. The world actually really seems different. In other words, we're not able to say, oh, I'm remembering all of these things and the world seems like a better place because I'm in a good mood. It actually legitimately seems different. Or it seems a lot more hostile when we're in a bad mood. It really does seem that way. We're not able to say, oh, it's because I'm in a bad mood today.